Welcome to part 2 of the sewing of the Three Bow Blouse Pattern. In part 1, we attached the applique to the neckline. We also sewed both darts of the front bodice. Now let's move on to the next step. Grab your fused facing pieces for the front and the back. As indicated by the pattern piece, we are going to overlock the bottom edge. For the back facings, you will overlock along this line. If you find this to be too curved, you can clip these areas, but make sure to clip it less than ½ inch. That way when you go ahead to serge it, to overlock it, you can straighten it as you're sewing along. So I'm going to take this to the machine and I will overlock these edges. Disengage the blade of your overlock if it has one to make sure you don't cut off any of the edges. After overlocking your facings, take the front facing and place it over the front neckline. Match all the notches together, then pin both layers in place. Sew at a ½ seam allowance. With an iron, press the seams open. With all the seam allowances pressed towards the fusing. We are then going to sew very close to the edge of the fusing. This is called a stay stitch and it helps the fusing from rolling over. Go ahead and grab your sleeve pieces for the next step. Reference your sleeve pattern and locate where the tunnel for the elastic will be. And with our iron, we will fold the top of our sleeve 2 times. Just like the pattern indicates, fold this top at a ½ inch twice and press with an iron each time. Occasionally, you should use your tape measure to check if you are folding at a ½ inch. It should look something like this, and you should make sure to do it for both sleeves. Pin the layers in place and stitch the edges with your sewing machine. The elastic will go through the tunnel you have created. For the measurement required for each shoulder, refer to the first page of your PDF. So my elastic measurement is 18 inches, so I need to cut 2 9-inch pieces of 1/4 inch wide elastic. Mark each elastic and cut. With a safety pin, pin the ends of the elastic. You will use this to tunnel the elastic through. Proceed with caution as you get to the end as to not lose the elastic through the tunnel. Leave a little bit of elastic at the end, take a pin to secure it. Then continue to slide the elastic through, then secure this end the same way. You will now stitch the ends of the elastic at about a 1/4 inch from the edge. Do this for all 4 ends. Your sleeves should now look like this. The next step is to attach the casing for the sleeve ruffle. Reference your sleeve pattern for the placement of the casing. It sits approximately 3½ inches from the hem, starting from the bottom of the gray box indicating optional sleeve tunnel. I will then mark the placement of the casings with chalk and my tape measure. Take the casing pieces and press in the seam allowance. Line them up against the edge of the marks, then pin in place. Go ahead and pin the other side as well. Take it to your sewing machine and stitch either side. Your sleeves should look something like this. Fold it in half to check that they line up. The sleeves are now ready to be attached to the front bodice. Grab your sleeves and front bodice. With the right sides of the fabric kissing, join the armholes together. Match your notches and make sure that the edges line up. Pin both layers together. The end of the sleeves where the elastic is should stop where the seam meets the facing. It should look like this. Repeat the same step to the other armhole. Do not rush this process. Take your time and meticulously pin through the curves, always making sure that the edges match. You can also run a wide basting stitch instead of pinning. This is a more stable way to secure the layers together, and it makes sewing so much easier. Comment down below if you prefer basting or pinning when sewing armholes. I would really love to know. Sew your armhole seams together with a ½ inch seam allowance. Do this very slowly and constantly make sure that your layers are lined up properly. Also check to make sure that you're not catching other parts of the garment and sewing over additional layers. Do not stretch or pull the fabric as you sew. As you reach the end, double check that your sleeve doesn't go past the facing. It should look a little something like this. Repeat the same step with the other sleeve. This is what our garment looks like so far. Next, fold your sleeves in towards the front bodice, like so. We will then take the ends of the facing and join it with the seam allowance of the armhole. Make sure to line up all the edges, and it should look like this. Let's see that again and do it one more time on the other side. As you fold, you will also include the seam allowance at the facing's edge. You will then flip it to the other side, where the stitching is visible. You will then pin all the layers in place. Our seam allowance here is still 1/2 inch, and we are going to use the stitch line as a sewing guide. We are then going to stitch all layers together, attaching the edge of the facing with the armhole seam allowance. Sew this part very slowly and make sure to follow the 1/2 inch seam allowance. After sewing both ends, it should look a little something like this. Next, we will take the armhole seam and with an overlock machine, clean the edges off. Do this for both sides of the armhole. It should look a little something like this. Because of multiple layers being stitched together, we need to clip the corners. Be very careful when doing this. Make sure that you do not accidentally cut off any of the stitching. Repeat the same step to the other side. We are now ready to flip the facing inside out. Grab each corner and with your thumb and pointer, turn it inside out. Do the same to the other side. And with an iron, press the neckline and the armhole seams flat. Next, you will take all your strap pieces and we will sew along the edge. Reference your pattern for the seam allowance and start sewing from the notch. If you are making the straps in a different color than the rest of the garment, make sure to use matching color thread. Proceed to sew all 6 straps. Each strap, taking your scissors, you want to go ahead and clip the corners, making sure that you do not clip any of the stitch line, but just enough to make a corner. This will help with turning the corners and making a very sharp arrow. You are going to also clip this corner like so, this corner like so, to open here. You're going to do that for all of these. And take your loop turner, and if you don't have a loop turner, you can always use a safety pin, but you are now going to turn these inside out. A loop turner or a tube turner. Hook the end of the strap and secure it in place. Then pull it through. Using a straight pin, pull out all the corners. This will ensure a nice pointy end of the strap. Do this for all the straps. This is what all the straps look like after pressing them with an iron. So the finished measurement for each strap is roughly around 1.25 inches. And just make sure that when you are pressing this to really stretch out the area where the seam is and fold it tight and run it with your iron so that you get the full measurement required for this garment. we have reached the end of part 2 of this 3 bow blouse sew along tutorial. To continue sewing the garment, make sure to watch the next tutorial. See you in part 3.